Oh gods, what am I doing here? She muttered to herself, stood in the fireplace of Malfoy Manor with her bones aching and heart in her mouth. The lord of the manor, Draco Malfoy himself, stood watching her with a smirk, slightly disheveled with the top 3 buttons of his Oxford open, bearing the porcelain chest beneath. Granger, he drawled, tongue darting out to dampen his lips. Here to pay your debt. She wasn't sure how she'd become this person, someone who'd make a deal with a snake, someone who could be so easily bought. She wondered how she'd have reacted 10 years ago, if someone would have suggested she'd stoop to this level to dig Ronald Weasley out of yet another hole of his creation. When did she become so weak as to let men walk all over her? She supposed she should have recognized the signs years ago. It was no secret that she had always sort of carried Ron, but she honestly believed that once he'd gotten over the grief of his brother's death, he would straighten himself out. Maybe the instant fame he got from being a third of the Golden Trio was like a dream come true for him. Sure, Hermione hated the publicity herself, but Ron had never received any kind of attention for his achievements, so she let him have it, let him relish in it, until it began to consume him, taking their marriage along for the ride. When he'd taken up drinking, he called it a vice. Everyone had one, so it wasn't a big deal. When he started staying out all hours, disappearing for days, he had blamed it on the fact he had given his teenage years to war. He deserved life, deserved to have fun. What he didn't deserve was his bossy wife breathing down his neck all the time. When he had been dismissed from horror training, she hadn't fought him on it. When he got arrested for brawling, she barely made a sound. When he got Lavender Brown pregnant, while Hermione sat alone in a restaurant on her birthday, she cried alone in her room, wouldn't burden him with her emotions. Then, when he got himself into a debt he couldn't repay, she stupidly did the only noble thing she could think of in hopes it might save her marriage. She went to visit the man responsible for collecting the debt. She hadn't expected Draco Malfoy to make things easy. It wasn't like she thought he would have her on some kind of payment plan or just let her off with a slap of the wrist. Yet, she hadn't considered his true intentions in her wildest dreams. He'll probably die before he scrapes enough together to pull this one off. Granger Draco whistled with raised eyebrows. Those collectors don't take kindly to wasters like Weasley. I give him a month before they get bored of his shitty attempts at hexing whoever comes for the installments. What will it take, Malfoy? She asked bluntly, ankles crossed together beneath the chair. He eyed her suspiciously from his place behind the desk, tilting his head as he raked his eyes over her until she squirmed uncomfortably under his gaze. Why, Granger? Draco drawled. Looking bored, you're an acceptable-looking witch, with popularity, and no doubt most of the ministry boys fawning over you. Why Weasley? I love him, she said automatically, sensing the robotic tone that accompanied it, and trying not to wince. Draco tutted, sounding disappointed. Just how much is that poor excuse of a man's life worth to a witch like you? Whatever it takes, she replied firmly, praying he couldn't hear her heart thudding behind her rib cage. You? He declared, eyes never leaving hers. When she opened her mouth but no response came out, he asserted himself once again. I want you, Granger, he explained, without averting his eyes one night, doing whatever I decide for you, no complaints. You want to imperious me, she voiced uncertainly. That won't be necessary, he chuckled under his breath. I'm a bastard. But I draw the line at consent. I want you willing. Or not at all. There's no other way. Look around you, sweetheart, he smirked, holding his hands out to the sides. I've got a multi-million galleon business. A life that's going pretty well considering my status as an ex-Death Eater, and I have idiots like your husband begging on their knees for my mercy. What else could you possibly offer me but a warm body and that smart mouth of yours? She'd felt horrified walking out of his office that day. All the way down the elevator she had thought over his terms, thought about Ron back home. Would this fix her marriage? Maybe if Ron had no worries, maybe if she rescued him from having a target on his head, Maybe then he would love her, like he said he did all those years ago. Hermione Granger had never been naive, and later she'd wonder what the turning point in her life was. Following Draco, though the halls of Malfoy Manor felt like an endless journey, he didn't bother to silence the portraits who sneered as she passed them. Didn't bother to hold the door for her, as she followed him into what must be his quarters, the constellation-charmed ceilings, the navy and mahogany decor. He wordlessly poured 2 fingers of fire whiskey into a glass tumbler, handing it over to her as she stood awkwardly peering at the golden concoction. Honestly, Granger, he scoffed, watching her apprehension. My preference includes conscious witches. There would be little point in poisoning or drugging you now, would there? She nodded, though not completely trusting his words, and threw back the harsh liquid in one. Her hand reached for her burning throat as she held out the glass for him to take. He chuckled under his breath and poured himself a drink in the same glass. He knocked it back at equal speed, but without the wince Hermione had displayed. Clearly, he was used to the harsher drinks. I want you to sign a contract, he hummed, snapping his fingers and summoning a piece of parchment. You're welcome to read over it. It just states that you are taking on the debt, and that you or I won't speak of this to anyone else. There's also the fact that you suggested obliviation after the event. If you still wish for that, I want it in writing that you consent to me performing a memory charm on you. She nodded, reading silently over each clause. It was acceptable, though it still felt surreal that she was agreeing to this whole thing in the first place. She took a breath and reached for the quill he offered, signing her name and sealing her fate before handing it back to him. Can I ask you a question? She wondered aloud, watching as he filed the contract away. He nodded absently, gesturing for her to continue. Why did you choose this? Surely the last thing you want is to touch a mudblood, let alone sleep with one. I put blood prejudice behind me a long time ago, Granger, so no, it doesn't bother me that you're Muggle-born. But what about the fact that it's me? What's your point? I can't picture you as the type of man who'd sleep with someone he wasn't attracted to just to settle a debt. I never claimed to not be attracted to you, Granger. That's your own confidence issue, he stated, raising an eyebrow when her eyes widened comically. Call it a teenage boy's bucket list, if you will. A bucket list. Yeah, I think most people have had some goals over the years, he smirked crudely. Mine was a little more specific back in Hogwarts. You considered this, me, in Hogwarts. Humiliate Weasley, get into Granger's knickers. He listed off, counting with his fingers. This was the perfect opportunity. What is it that the Muggles say? 2 birds, 1 stone. How can you humiliate Ron if you've agreed to keep this a secret? I don't have to tell him anything. But every time I see that boring freckled fuck, I'll remember the time I made his wife come so hard she saw stars. He bit his lip with a smirk, and then I'll come back home and relive it through my pensieve pride of place next to the vial of the Gryffindor princess, making her grand entrance to the Yule Ball. You have that. She frowned, face full of bewilderment. Why? You know, for a swat, you never were good at picking up on signals. It's a wonder an idiot like Weasel got you to marry him. Draco shook his head. You always were an annoying, prissy little bitch, but even the Slytherins couldn't deny you'd got a cracking little body under those robes. What? You were the talk of the common room quite frequently, he revealed with a crude smirk. Pretty sure you were the first witch I ever wanked over. It's quite funny, really, considering I couldn't stand you and my father would have killed me if he knew. But there you were, with your hideous hair, the center of my filthy fantasies for quite a while. I don't want to hear any more, Hermione said awkwardly, wringing her hands together. She'd never considered herself to be a desirable witch. She was pretty in an average sort of way, but to hear those sort of stories from the mouth of her enemy was twisting her gut in an unusual way. Did the whiskey settle your nerves? She nodded mutely, though she could feel the sensation rising again. Follow me. Then he nodded his head in the direction of an adjoining door. May as well get this show on the road. Hey. The room was colored with muted grays. A few shelves lined the walls with various books and trinkets, but other than that, it gave the impression of a hardly used room. The flooring was hard stone. She could feel the chill bouncing from the echoes of the walls. "This isn't your room," Hermione mumbled unintelligently, looking up at him with an uncertain gaze. 10 points to Gryffindor, he mused. "No, Granger, you don't get to go to my room until you ask nicely." "I don't understand." He closed the gap between them with a single stride, forcing her to look up at him at an uncomfortable angle. "You're going to get on your knees for me. Get me off until you can't take it anymore," he smirked. "And then you're going to beg me to take you to bed. Otherwise, we'll stay here all night. And if I don't, then it'll be a long night of sucking cock for you, golden girl, and I'm not sure your pale little knees will want to be kneeling on the hard stone for 12 hours. She blinked wordlessly, looking around hesitantly. "Down you go, princess," he whispered, pressing his palms firmly to her shoulders until she knelt before him. Hermione didn't consider herself a prude. She was fully aware of what was expected of her, but she wouldn't call herself experienced either. Ronald was a rather sloppy lover. He would do the bare minimum to get himself off, and mostly Hermione just let him. So to be watching her own hands fumble with Draco Malfoy's belt felt like being in an entirely different world. She hoped she wouldn't embarrass herself with inexperience. Draco took pity on her, popping the buckle, and then the button open, and allowing her to shimmy his trousers down to his muscular thighs. His erection was already straining against his shorts. She hesitantly pressed her hand against the hardened length, and carved out the shape beneath the material with her fingertips. Draco had a lot of equipment to back up his endless talk. She felt intimidated the moment she felt his cocked twitch beneath her trembling hand. She stroked her hand firmly across the fabric until a wet spot formed and seeped through the material, coating her fingers liberally. At least she was doing something right. She glanced up at Draco, who was stood with his eyes shut, lips pressed together and short breaths coming from his nose. Taking her hands to either side of his hips, she hooked her fingers beneath the waistband and tugged his shorts down to meet his trousers, springing the literal snake from its den until it bobbed temptingly in front of her face. She eyed the tip apprehensively, her eyes hesitantly raking down the length and taking in the thickness that disappeared beneath a neat smattering of dark blonde curls at the base. She felt Draco's hand on the back of her head before she heard his soft, velvety tones slowly. "Don't be scared." She glanced up at him with wide eyes before raising herself on high knees and tentatively poking her tongue out from between her lips, swiping it across the tip to get a taste for the tangy pre-cum before fitting her lips around the swollen head and sucking gently. Draco gave a low groan from above her, his fingers knotting themselves in her unruly hair. "That's it," he sighed hoarsely, putting gentle pressure on her head until she took the hint and began to inch her way down. "Good girl." Just like that. She couldn't take him all, so she let her hand clasp around the remaining length, instead, focusing on sucking the mouthful she currently had control of, pressing her tongue to the vein on the underside of his cock, beginning to slide up and down in a controlled rhythm. "Yeah!" he hissed from between clenched teeth. "Knew you'd take it well. Always the overachiever." Her tongue was getting a thick coating by now, the steady stream of pre-cum weeping from his slit as she swallowed it down. She reached her small hand between his legs, deciding to put into practice something she had read in one of Ginny's saucy novels. As she rolled his heavy bollocks around between her fingers, cupping them with her palm, and then rubbing the pads of her fingers over the skin, he shuddered, muttering an apology when his hips unconsciously thrust into her, his cock hitting the back of her throat. Hermione would like to have been able to say she was unaffected, but the rumble of a moan that came from her lips was unmistakable, though it was muted slightly by the intrusion in her mouth. The vibrations it sent through Draco was enough to make his fingers tighten in her hair. "Fuck. You're loving this, aren't you?" he groaned, guiding her now by the fistful of hair choking on my cock like a good girl. "You look so pretty stretched around me like that." Hermione blushed under his gaze, surprised she could be embarrassed at all when she was already on her knees for her childhood bully with his leaking penis on her tongue. She looked up at him curiously, noted the way he bit his lip and furrowed his brow as he watched her take him in and out. She couldn't deny that it was exhilarating to watch his desire so open in his expression. There was a darker part of her that was somehow thrilled to be the object of his want. Later, she'd blame that misguided feeling for the slowly increasing dampness between her legs. She allowed Draco to guide her freely, breathing through her nose as she relaxed her throat and took all he was willing to give her. She boldly stared up at him as he rutted against her, his lips parting and eyes half-lidded. She could tell he was approaching his release from the sudden unevenness of his thrusts. The slight tremor as he reached out his free hand to cradle her jaw and pressed against the wall of her throat as deeply as he could, the wiry blonde hair at the base of his cock tickling her nose as he groaned and shuddered his climax. "Not the frigid little swat you appear to be, are you?" Hermione took deep breaths when she was released, rubbing at her aching neck and ignoring his lewd comment. Her knees were struggling to hold her upright. He'd been serious about the hard flooring, and she was certain she'd have bruises to glamour come morning. She looked up at Draco, who was watching her with a knowing look in his eye, one eyebrow risen in askance, as he waited for the inevitable words to slip from her tongue. "I'd like you to take me to bed now, please." Draco's actual bedroom was different from what she expected. The Slytherin green was replaced with a subtle pewter, the glossy white accents bringing a brightness to the room that she hadn't anticipated. His bed looked luxurious as she approached it, much more fitting for a master bedroom than the second-hand sheets and lumpy mattress she and Ron had back home. Her perusal was interrupted by the click of the bedroom door shutting, Draco leaning against it as he watched her, his eyes assessing her body and making her feel warm all over. "I want you to strip for me, and then climb onto the bed," Draco instructed, with no room for negotiation. She watched for a few seconds as he loosened his tie and began to unbutton his shirt, nodding towards her own clothing before continuing. Hermione took a breath before swallowing her nerves and slipping her shoes off, nudging them under the bed and out of the way. It instantly made her a few inches shorter, the tall and dominant form of the Malfoy heir more obvious at her usual height. She reached beneath her simple dress to remove her knickers, scrunching them up into a ball and leaving them next to her shoes. She faltered for a moment, remembering the zip on the reverse side of her dress, unreachable without her wand. She hesitated before looking up at Draco, who was now stood naked, staring at her, aware and amused at her predicament. "You, turn around," which he strode towards her without letting her stutter the question out. Hermione's breath caught as she felt Draco's hands on her, steadying his hold at the nape of her neck and slowly dragging the zip down until it revealed the cleft of her arse. She felt him sigh against her neck before using both hands to slip the fabric from her shoulders and let the dress fall to the ground. Hermione stood still as Draco's hands roamed her exposed skin, his mouth dragging slowly across her shoulder, while his fingertips traced gently down her spine. She'd never had a man pay this much attention to her body before, and while she was nervous, she couldn't help but feel slightly empowered by the effect she seemed to have on his self-control. By now, his hands were wandering, over her hips, flat against her navel and lower, just teasing until his fingertips brushed the faint curls of her mound. Then his hands would move upwards, stroking her torso until his large palms cupped her ample breasts, his aroused body pressing against the back of her own, his groan buried into her hair. Draco's hands were calloused and rough, she suspected from the amount of Quidditch he obviously still played to keep in such good shape. They felt glorious as he played with her tits, pinching and rolling her dusky nipples until they elongated, and Hermione couldn't help but let out breathy sighs, her body falling against him comfortably. She could feel his erection rubbing against the crease of her arse, and couldn't deny that the sensation of his slick crown dragging against her unexplored pucker each time he edged forwards made her so wet her thighs began to grow, slippery in anticipation. "I want you on the bed." Facing me, he mumbled lowly into her ear before running a long finger through her wet slit and lifting it up to show her, "I want your thighs spread wide so I can see that pretty pink pussy you've been hiding." There was no sexy way for Hermione to climb onto the bed, but she did her best not to look nervous as she crawled into the middle and slowly turned around to see Draco perched at the bottom, with his swollen cock in his fist. She watched him stare at her center until she parted her thighs and let her feet slide along the silky sheets. He didn't muffle his low groan as she revealed herself, instead growling out an equally hoarse fuck. Granger as he viewed her offering. "Tell me." He spoke quietly. "Does Weasley often make you come?" Hermione hesitated before shaking her head. What difference would it make for him to know? "You finish yourself off?" he guessed, not taking his eyes off her cunt even when she nodded. "I want you to show me," he growled, settling himself on his knees. As he stroked the velvety skin of his cock, "I want you to use your fingers to make yourself come for me. And if you do a good job, I use my mouth on you. And if I do a bad job," she dared, looking up at his smirk, "I'll smack that gorgeous arse of yours until you cry for me to stop." Hermione couldn't decide if that was truly a punishment or not. She had never been spanked before, but from the descriptions in Ginny's books, it sounded like a surefire way to have her entire body convulsing in minutes. Still, she set out to do a good job, reaching down between her legs with 2 fingers to rub around the soft skin surrounding her clit. She let out a tiny whimper, circling her sensitive button until it was swollen, but still refusing to touch it for as long as she could handle. "Has anyone ever told you how pretty your cunt is, Granger?" "And no." Hermione shuddered, her fingers edging closer. "So swollen and pink. I want to feel that clit throbbing on my tongue." Hermione pressed her middle finger into her center, avoiding the bundle of nerves that was begging to be touched. She began to pump in and out slowly, before adding a second to sink in beside it, crooking her fingers to brush her spot, but she could barely reach. She pulled her knees up higher, intent on reaching deeper, as Draco groaned and shuffled closer, using his large palms to secure her thighs in position as she fingered herself. "Deeper, Granger. You know you can," he hummed, pushing on her thighs to make it easier. She finally reached an angle where she could repeatedly stroke her G-spot, her thighs beginning to tremble under his grip before she used her free hand to push against her throbbing button, rubbing figure eights as her back began to arch. "That's it, Granger." Good girl, Draco groaned, feeling closer to her core than she remembered as she squeezed her eyes shut. She could feel the telltale heat pooling in her stomach, the goosebumps rising on her skin that signaled her climax. She threw her head back in a silent scream, as her pussy clenched around her fingers, and her entire body quaked to release. Draco didn't give her any time to recover. She barely felt his hands leave her legs before his mouth was on her, his skilled tongue thrusting into her channel and coating itself in her release. "Draco," she gasped as he moved up to take her clit in his mouth, suckling and nipping, his hum of appreciation vibrating through her core. "So fucking sweet," he mumbled against her between licks like my own personal nectar. She let her eyes flutter shut as he thrust 2 long, thick fingers inside her body, locating that elusive G-spot instantly and pounding relentlessly into it. He didn't remove his fingers as he knelt up on his knees, repeatedly slamming into her sweet spot as she writhed uncontrollably from what was probably the first time a man had focused on her needs. He didn't warn her when he lined up his swollen cock, thrusting into the hilt barely a second after he wrenched his fingers from her and shoved them in her open mouth. Hermione whined from the unexpected intrusion, sucking obediently on his fingers as he began to move his hips, building up speed before ramming himself unapologetically into her tight heat. He wasted no time in pushing her legs up onto his shoulders and leaning into her, practically folding her in half in a way she'd never experienced before. He pinned her wrists roughly above her head, holding her down as he pleasured her so thoroughly. "I'm close again," she whined, delirious with want. "Bet your husband doesn't make you feel like this," Draco grunted, circling his hips. "Skillfully admit it." I can't," she gasped pitifully. "Yes, you can. And you will. You're not coming on my cock until you tell me." Hermione squeezed her eyes shut, hating herself for feeling so fulfilled by this man, of all people. "Look at me," he gritted out, pinching her clit until she squealed. "Tell me who makes you feel like this. Fucking tell me the only person who makes you feel like this." Hermione shook her head regretfully, trying to block out the delicious euphoria radiating through her body as he teased her clit. Say it, and I'll make you come so hard. So fucking hard, Hermione." She vaguely registered that it was probably the first time she'd heard her given name on his lips, without it being an insult. "You're mine, Hermione," he growled, thrusting wildly as his thumb rubbed rapidly at her clit. "No matter who you fuck, they'll never compare to this. You'll never feel as good as you do wrapped around my cock. Say it. Fucking tell me who does this too." "Draco?" she cried out in a strangled voice, her orgasm hitting her out of nowhere and gushing between them. The first time she'd ever squirted, flooding over Draco Malfoy's cock until he shuddered his own release with a guttural moan. Hermione lay in postcoital bliss for a few minutes, her panting all that could be heard in the room apart from Draco's heavy breathing. She'd never been so thoroughly satisfied, never felt so complete, but the thought darkened in her head as the euphoria faded away. She'd just been fucked by her husband's worst enemy to pay a debt. She felt disgusting. Draco didn't speak as he watched her emotions set in, the way her tired and used body limped to the end of the bed, and she began to redress quietly. He joined her a few minutes later, putting his own clothes back on and wordlessly fastening the zip on her dress for her. "You'll come back," Draco spoke calmly, a suspicious quirk to the left corner of his mouth. "You won't be able to help yourself, and I'll have you here again and again. Maybe on the antique rug in my father's office, maybe on the billiards table where the Slytherin alumni enjoy their Friday nights. Mark my words, Granger, this isn't the last time I watch you writhe beneath me." "Don't count on it," she spat with narrowed eyes as she turned on her heel. "My debt is fulfilled, Malfoy." "Then I'll escort you to the flue," he smiled politely. She was wary that he hadn't bothered sparring back at her like he normally would, but she was too eager to get out of there to think about it. Too eager to go home to her boring, predictable life and forget that this entire ordeal ever happened. Draco stood a few steps behind her, watching her approach the fireplace and step inside the dusty flue. She turned hesitantly, watching his near emotionless reaction before she jutted her chin out with fake confidence. "I believe you promised me an obliviation spell." "That I did, Princess," he huffed, seemingly pleased with himself. "You never miss a trick, do you?" It unnerved her to stand at the mercy of her childhood bully, his wand resting against the space between her brows, but she'd be thankful to not remember the events of this evening each time she saw him at the ministry. In the alley, she wasn't sure she could stomach the deception of holding her husband's hand while reliving the memory of being beneath another man. She let out a sigh of relief as she listened to the incantation slide easily and practiced from his mouth. Then there was nothingness. "Oh gods, what am I doing here?" she muttered to herself, stood in the fireplace of Malfoy Manor with her bones aching and heart in her mouth. The lord of the manor, Draco Malfoy himself, stood watching her with a smirk, slightly disheveled with the top 3 buttons of his Oxford open, bearing the porcelain chest beneath. "Granger," he drawled, tongue darting out to dampen his lips, "here to pay your debt.